The South Carolina sequel is the biggest story of the year, without a doubt. I do think it's natty or bust for this group. Paige Bueckers' final hurrah at UConn, with the burden of possibly leaving after 5 years without a national championship. That's a lot of pressure for a young player. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's edition of The Late Sub. I am your host, Claire Watkins. It is Monday, November 4th, and we are going to dive into the wide, wacky world of college basketball, which, if you can believe it, starts this week. We're going to do an NWSL roundup and say sayonara to the NWSL regular season with a look ahead to the postseason. And one quick shout out to the U.S. Women's National Team U17s, who did everybody very proud this weekend, getting third at the World Cup. Lots to talk about. Let's dig in. Okay, so if you can believe it, basketball is over. Welcome back. Basketball in the wake of a fabulous WNBA finals. We have college basketball back on the schedule. The big tip-off actually is happening today as we speak, as we're recording. USC is playing Ole Miss. Some really nice ranked matchups to start the week. So we're just going to hit some of the big storylines, some of the topics I think you're going to be hearing a lot, some of the big stars to watch out for, some of the changes from last year to this year, and what teams you can expect to sit at the top of the mountain at the end of the season. Because maybe this is my big theory or my big thesis at the beginning of this season, is that we always talk about parity in college basketball, because with the transfer portal, with NIL, with some of the different opportunities for players at a lot of different schools, we're seeing competition go up. However, what we're also seeing, especially this year, is a consolidation of talent at the top due to the transfer portal or due to conference realignment. We're seeing some of these big programs with coaches that people trust, programs that people trust, schools that people want to attend, bring people in again through the transfer portal, through NIL money, through those resources and those opportunities to stack these teams and compete for a national championship. I was actually reading some of ESPN's coverage this morning as I was previewing this episode, and I found it very interesting that they were talking about, this sort of the end of an era and the beginning of a new one. And that's very true. It's not only just that you saw, obviously, the highest scorer in college basketball history leave that part of the sport in Caitlin Clark going to the WNBA, but you just had some of the biggest stars leave as well. You saw some like Angel Reese, Camila Cardoso, Cameron Brink. That all happening at the same time as conference realignment, I think, sets us up for a new landscape, if not necessarily a new era of the sport of college basketball. Because as we know, a lot of these stars of this year were stars of last year. They just happen to maybe be freshmen. They happen to maybe be sophomores. We're seeing these underclassmen have a chance to take a step forward. And when reading ESPN's coverage, I found it very interesting that just mostly what they said, it was mostly chalk. I mean, everyone knows that predictions at the beginning of a season, certainly a college basketball season, you can't predict the ebbs and the flows of a season. You cannot predict who's going to surprise. You can't predict injuries. All of these you always have to take with a grain of salt. A lot of times people do predictions just because they're asked to do predictions, but it was a lot of chalk. It was a lot of expecting South Carolina to do very, very well after going undefeated last season. It was expecting teams like USC or UCLA, who have consolidated a lot of talent around their superstars, or UConn kind of putting it all together this year, that you saw that when they were making these predictions for the Final Four. And so in that same vein, I'm going to focus on some of these big, big, big teams that we do expect to be not only dominating at the beginning of a season, but also at the end, because that seems like maybe a good grounding point for even some of the surprises that we're going to see during this college basketball season. So I do think you have to begin with South Carolina. As everyone knows, they win the national championship last year after going completely undefeated. They run the table from beginning to end. They have had incredibly successful seasons over the last 3 years. You can even remember they win the national title in 2022. They fall just short in 2023 in the Final Four after running the table all the way up until that point. And then they go completely undefeated in 2023-24. So this team is good. It is replenishingly good. They see superstars leave. You see Aaliyah Boston leave, and they do very, very well. I think they have that same expectation with Camila Cardoso off to the WNBA. That sequel, the South Carolina sequel, is the biggest story of the year, without a doubt. But what I'm curious about is some of the mentality stuff. And I think everyone knows that begins and ends with Dawn Staley, their head coach, who not only does a very good job of combining talent and finding different ways to get them to buy into team culture and recruiting these incredibly talented players, but also getting them to play like good teammates and really play for the team and sacrifice minutes maybe to win a national championship or really fit into that ethos that she has for South Carolina basketball. but they also maintained a pretty serious edge last year that only really became obvious after they won the national championship. I didn't realize this. If you go back and look at my recap of the Final Four, I will say I didn't realize until you see that emotional moment with Aaliyah Boston after that game that they were doing it for the seniors of the previous year. They were doing it for that freshies senior class that didn't get to go out on a win. And even as she talked about going for like a master's, Dawn Staley says she went from like a master's thesis to daycare with the team getting younger. They had that kind of controlling factor, that sort of focusing factor of wanting to do this kind of revenge tour for those seniors. Can you maintain that same level of focus after completely running the table? I think that is the question for them, just as much as it is who's going to be, their power player in the paint. What are they going to be able to combine to utilize their outside shooting, but also have that dominance inside that we know South Carolina has always had as part of their calling card when they do very well. Key freshman to watch is Joyce Edwards. She comes in as a very highly touted prospect. Biggest questions are in the paint, but they return a lot of those players who were such key contributors to that national title. You look at Tahina Powpow, Bree Hall, Raven Johnson, Tessa Johnson, Malaysia Fulwiley, Chloe Kitts. They do not have Ashlyn Watkins available at the beginning of the season because she's out for off-the-court issues. I don't know if they're going to see her return at any point in this season, but there's a lot of talent there, and there's no reason to think that they won't at the very least be able to make a deep postseason run, because with South Carolina, it's always the same. It's always that team buy-in. It's the depth. They always have these new players come in and surprise you. And all of these players, again, those ones that I just listed, they all have national championship experience. And that goes a long way, even if you're looking at a player like Fulwiley, who's just a sophomore. However, the other contenders, and I think we're going to talk about the big three here, are almost more impressive than they even were last year. I think we have to switch over to UConn, right? UConn preseason number 2. Paige Bueckers' final hurrah at UConn, with the burden of possibly leaving after 5 years without a national championship. That's a lot of pressure for a young player. UConn craves championships. I think she would ultimately consider her college experience to be, maybe the word failure comes into there. And I'm not even saying that like I would say that, but I do think that a player as competitive as she is might say a failure without bringing a national championship to UConn, which was the expectation when she came into that group. They'll have AZ Fudd back. Hopefully she stays healthy. I think the key, obviously, is to have Bueckers and Fudd together on the court. Everything kind of, they are the sun that the rest of the team sort of orbits around. But they also have some key transfers. They brought in Caitlin Chen, who is a super savvy pickup. She's a very talented point guard who graduated from Princeton last year. And the reason why they were able to recruit her so openly is because the Ivy League doesn't allow grad players. So she graduates from Princeton. She has a 5th year available, her COVID year available. She wants to keep playing college basketball. She can't do it at Princeton. UConn is able to land her. She's going to be the one who's going to be asked to unlock the team's offense. You expect Paige a little bit more off ball. She's going to be more of a shooting guard. That's really not bad. Bueckers' versatility is one of her greatest strengths, but I think if they can focus her into one role, and that is scoring as much as possible, I think that that's going to be what carries UConn forward. They also have a really key freshman, Sarah Strong, the number 1 recruit of the 2024 class. She's going to be able to make an immediate impact. I do think it's natty or bust for this group. And I'm very hopeful that we get to see some old-fashioned UConn basketball from this team, because I think they have all the pieces together, and even people that I didn't even mention, like Ashlyn Shade or KK Arnold. This is a really talented team, and if they just get a little bit of time to gel and they don't have the injury issues that they've had in the past couple years, I think they, for me, might be the favorites in the context of really having, again, that focusing force, that guiding light of trying to finally get this national championship for a player like Bueckers, or even Fudd, who is moving on after this year as well. But another team to contend with, USC. They made huge strides last year. They bring in Juju Watkins, who is everything of the superstar that they hoped she would be. And they expect to do even better with that this year after having made some offseason changes to kind of level up. This is where we're going to start to get into, I mentioned transfers, I mentioned key freshmen with these other 2 teams. But this is where we're going to talk about the dissolution of the Pac-12 and what that means for some of the heavy hitters of this season, USC and specifically UCLA. So USC and UCLA were 2 of the best teams in the Pac-12 last year. Stanford was the 3rd. USC and UCLA are going to the Big Ten, which is for them a positive in that they are not kind of stuck. You've got Stanford that has to go to the ACC. You had some of these other teams that didn't even have those other large conference options, and you saw a lot of players transfer out. Teams like Oregon State, teams like Washington State, their women's basketball programs functionally ceased to exist in the same way because they had so many players ask out. And so you see USC benefit from that. They bring in Kiki Iriafen from Stanford. They bring in Talia von Oelhoffen from Oregon State. This is a blockbuster team brought in through USC's resources, the fact they're going to be playing in the Big Ten, and the fact that they have Juju Watkins. And I think that they're going to do everything they possibly can to build a championship winning team around her for as long as they have her. Maybe an overall question mark is who's going to play point guard for them. I was watching a little bit of USC's game against Ole Miss before I hopped on to record. Seemed like they had Watkins bringing the ball up as often as not. So I do think they're figuring some of that ball progression rotation, but way more balanced than it was last year. It's going to still rely on Watkins to be a superstar. But there is this question, I think, of conference realignment. We saw this with volleyball. I felt like volleyball, especially in women's sports, was kind of the first test of what does all of this conference realignment mean? You saw it in soccer as well. Stanford is not in the top 25 for women's basketball in preseason. And part of that is because their legendary coach has moved on. And some of it is because Cameron Brink graduated. And some of it is because a player like Iriafen has transferred out. But it's just hard to be Stanford in the ACC. And we have seen that played out in every single sport so far this fall. And I also think that these SoCal teams are going to be dealing with a lot of travel. It seems like they were as kind logistically as they possibly could be to bring the Midwest teams over to SoCal to do kind of a SoCal swing so that the UC and UCLA don't have to travel as much. But it's going to be tricky. It's going to be different. It's going to be something that these players have never experienced before. I mean, USC and Ole Miss are playing this game in Paris. You've got Louisville and UCLA in Paris. The bigger resources in college basketball is actually going to be something that I think these players have to get used to. USC is my pick to win the Big Ten, but I'm really curious to see how Lindsey Gottlieb, their head coach, turns this group into kind of a home team. So now quick hitters on some of the other teams I think are going to have something to say this season. I don't know. I really think those big three are the big three for a reason, but I think if you look at all of these other teams, these are the teams that you expect to see in the mix in the Elite Eight, in the Final Four. As we saw, like a team like NC State makes the Final Four last year. There's always a chance to go very far if you've built kind of the teams that these teams have. So maybe we should switch over to UCLA. Very similar story in many ways to USC, except for the fact that they do not have Juju Watkins. Kiki Rice was their star freshman last year. Lauren Betts was their star transfer last year. It's a round 2 with them. They do have to replace Charisma Osborne, but they also did really well in the portal with former Pac-12 teams. They brought in a very good player from Oregon State. They brought in a player from Washington State. Very similar story in the transfer portal of if you were a Pac-12 player and you were good, if you were good enough to make a true big impact, you are going to transfer out into some of these teams that are still in these major conferences. So I think UCLA, no matter what, is going to be a tough out. They relied on their defense a lot last year. They relied on their length a lot last year. I think Betts is playing for like as high of a spot as she can possibly get in the WNBA draft. Curious to see if UCLA can push forward. They had kind of a disappointing postseason last year. Curious to see if they can take the next step. Texas is another really good example of a team that is expected to continue to progress because they had a very nice young core last year. They've got Rory Harmon back from injury. Their freshman of the year, Madison Booker, is going to be a sophomore this year. I'm going to keep mentioning these former freshmen because last year's freshman class is truly the core upon which I think a lot of these teams are based. They're going to be just as good in the postseason this year as they were last year. I think Texas is a team to watch. Notre Dame, another team to watch. They are so talented. My only question for Notre Dame a lot of the time is just, I need to see this particular group do something that we've never seen them do before. And I am always curious if you have less of that NCAA tournament experience of really pushing into those final rounds, can you get that done in maybe that final year of that window? We're going to see the return of Olivia Miles, which is going to be a huge boost for Notre Dame. She's finally hopefully going to be able to combine with Hannah Hidalgo, who, as we know, was one of the best point guards in the country as a freshman last year. They've got Sonia Citron. They've got Maddie Westbelt, though already there are some notes that they've maybe been hit with the injury bug already a little bit in preseason. Injuries have always been their issue. Kind of like UConn. You've got these teams where you're just like, oh man, they would be able to ball out so hard if they could just keep everybody available. Hopefully that will be the story for Notre Dame, but we've yet to see it. LSU. Tigers post Angel Reese, post Haley Van Lith. The LSU, I'm kind of high on LSU this year. If you listened to the show last year, I was a little bit low on LSU last year. I'm a little bit high on LSU this year, which has nothing to do with my regard for Angel Reese or even Haley Van Lith. I just think they make more tactical sense this year than they did last year. The kind of two big system that they ran with Anissa Morrow and Angel Reese definitely divided out both of those players' usage. It took them some time to get used to that. As we saw, they transferred Haley Van Lith over into a point guard. She was not comfortable doing that. That was a team that did best talent available at any cost And we saw what the cost was last year. I think this is now going to be a team where the roles are a little bit clearer. I think this is Flage Johnson's team now. I think Morrow is going to see her usage go up in the paint. She's a little bit small to play a more traditional post role, but I do think she has good experience in being that high usage kind of power forward. I think we're going to see Michaela Williams have an impact. I think they're going to be less flashy than they were last year, but perhaps more tactically sound. Even quicker hits. Iowa State, I'm just excited to see Audie Crooks play again. She was one of the stars of the NCAA tournament last year. Iowa State is going to be very, very good. And then a little bit of a dark horse, TCU. I talk about Haley Van Lith. She has gone on to transfer to TCU. They went heavy on transfers this year. I have absolutely no idea if this group works as a team, but a very talented squad. So ultimately, I think what we saw last year, we saw this actually with an injury-riddled UConn or USC as they kind of focused around Watkins, or truly what we saw from South Carolina going undefeated, is that in college basketball, like the pros, but even more in college basketball, it's about who can create the best team by the end of the season. And so much of this preseason stuff, talking about the talent and all of that, yes, every team here has the pieces, but what can their coaching staff do? What can their training staff do? And how can these players respond to create the best team that's going to take them the farthest? But if you enjoyed this year's WNBA season, college is a little bit of a different monster. It's lower scoring. You're going to see fewer threes, but you're going to see some really special stuff. And it's just a really nice thing to go into this winter to see kind of the stars of tomorrow and the stars of today. So very stoked for this college basketball season. But from preseason to postseason, again, the clock keeps turning, the calendar keeps switching. We're talking about NWSL. We saw the end of the NWSL regular season this weekend. Goodness gracious, the 2024 NWSL regular season, it was long. We saw some high highs. We saw some low lows. We saw some powerhouses, some blockbusters. It was an attacker's dream. We saw superstar signings. We saw a new CBA. It was a very rejuvenating season, I think, for the NWSL, and also one that feels like it's going to have a ripple effect in years to come. We saw both success and struggles at the expansion level as the league actually prepares for even more expansion in the upcoming years. And now the playoffs are set, and it's the largest postseason field that we've also seen in NWSL history. So everything for NWSL this year is bigger, flashier, more exciting. I think the ultimate question that we're going to be asking ourselves for years to come is it better? Because like I said, we saw some high highs, but we also saw some low lows. No drama, actually, as it turned out in the final weekend, and kind of a very different conversation than last year. Portland and Bay make it in. They go bop, bop, 1-2. Portland gets in on Friday. Bay gets in on Saturday. Louisville, who had to wait till Sunday due to their scheduling, didn't have anything to play for by the time they actually kicked off. Thorns punched their ticket with a very emphatic win over Angel City on Friday. They were celebrating Christine Sinclair. It was her, I believe, her final game at Providence Park. It would take big, big upsets in the postseason for that not to be true. Lovely celebration for her that had really nice sequences from all of their attacking stars, Sinclair included. End of an era. Bay FC, now the winningest first-year expansion team in NWSL history, snagged the 7th seed with a 3-2 win over Houston. Bay FC, we're going to talk about them more in the upcoming weeks, but what they were able to do from first half of season to second half of season is pretty remarkable. I think we saw a lot of promise in the first half, but no control. And then we saw them make a couple key signings, a couple key switches, getting a lot more out of their attack while also stabilizing their defense. And we see this turnaround, and they do make the playoffs in 7th. Chicago, poor Chicago, slides to 8th after actually clinching before Portland and Bay. They have not had a great run in at the end of the regular season. And let's talk about that a little bit, the momentum, because we did the goodbyes to the non-playoff teams at the end of last week. I'm glad we did that, because with the postseason, I always say this in pretty much every sport. Yes, you can analyze, you can talk about performances, but really what matters is who wins. And so much of that comes down to momentum. As everybody knows, we're coming off of the international break. And that's been mostly good, actually, for these playoff teams. I think you saw some teams looking like they might be running out of gas at the end of the run into the international break. You saw Orlando have a little bit of a 2-game skid. You saw Portland struggling to get healthy. You saw Washington struggle to get Trinity Rodman back to full minutes. Gotham having to do a lot of rotation because they had a very heavy schedule with the Summer Cup and the Champions Cup, while also handling regular season for the NWSL. All of those teams, Kansas City included, looked really, really good coming out of the international break. They look healthy. They look like they are focused. If you have teams like, this is kind of what happens when a team like Orlando wins the Shield as early as they did. Both Orlando and the other teams, yeah, they're playing for seeding, but you're kind of like, okay, we're locked into playoffs. We want to get a good seed, but Orlando has won the trophy. So how do we take a second to rest while playing, rest without playing, and then be ready for postseason. And I do think we saw that from all of these top teams. However, the two teams that it feels a little bit less good, North Carolina suffered their first loss at home. This was against Washington, so they were playing a playoff team. But that just feels like an ill omen for a team that's likely going to be on the road for however long their postseason lasts. Just bad. Just doesn't feel great coming out of that international break. You lose your first game at home in the very last regular season game of the year, and now you have to go into playoffs as the underdog. And then Chicago, who does end up in 8th, they are 8th. Chicago did very, very well to make it into the postseason. They were without Ludmilla, who was out for a number of games with red card suspension, and they just don't stack up well against the other contenders here. They made it to the playoffs by winning the winnable games, which means winning games against teams who were not playoff ready. But when they do play teams that were good enough to make it into the postseason, you can kind of see the difference there. So good for the Red Stars for making it this far. It has not been a great end of the season for them, and it feels like you maybe just take this as the benchmark and move on. We also saw some individual wrap-ups. Temwa Chawinga is officially the 2024 Golden Boot winner with a league record 20 goals and 6 assists. She didn't even play in the season finale against Chicago. They said they had a knee issue. Hopefully that's not bad. Terrifying to think that she might be out for the postseason. Hopefully that's not a big deal, and they were just withholding her because they were locked in to 4th. We saw, speaking of injuries, Croy Bethune finishes as the league's assist leader with 10 assists, despite being sidelined since August. So that we're gonna do a much longer segment on this show where I go through my logic for all of my awards voting. But Bethune, I just think is a very interesting case, which is that she was the runaway Rookie of the Year front runner before she got hurt. She does miss a significant portion of the season due to injury, but we do see some of these stats, some of these output stats hold. Going to be a tough call. Incredible year, like I said, for attackers. It was not a great year defensively. We saw a lot of goals scored, even just team-wide. I think it was Kansas City that scored the most goals from a team in NWSL history. We saw Washington and Orlando notch the most wins for a team in NWSL history. Like I said, Bay has the most wins for an inaugural expansion team in NWSL history. It was a longer season, and the good teams were really good, and they really kind of beat up on those teams at the bottom of the table. To illustrate that, I think what's going to be remembered from this year is sort of the best and the rest. 5 points between the top 4, which is Orlando, Washington, Gotham, and Kansas City. 16 points between 4th and 5th, which I just think really says it all. But the nice thing with what that means for the postseason, and again, we're going to talk about our preview a little bit later this week, there are powerhouses in each quarter of this quarterfinal quadrant. So even if it doesn't necessarily feel like the teams in the lower half of the postseason quadrant are going to be able to compete as well, maybe the field's a little bit too big for how large the league is at this moment. The postseason is going to be really, really good. And if not this weekend, it's going to be this good as the weeks go forward. So we'll talk briefly about the field and then go from there. Orlando is going to face Chicago. So number 1, Orlando faces number 8, Chicago. Number 2, Washington plays number 7, Bay FC. Number 3, Gotham plays number 6, Portland. And number 4, Kansas City plays number 5, North Carolina. I said before, I think Chicago's about packed up. I just don't expect much from them on the road against Orlando, and I think that's fine. They did very, very well to make the postseason. They have a lot to do in the offseason. That's fine for Chicago. But I think the other 3 games might be a little bit closer than everybody thinks. I think, Bay FC has carried a significant amount of momentum, like I said, into this postseason push, and they play good teams well. I think they're more tactically versatile than maybe they get some credit for. I don't think Washington should take that matchup lightly. Portland looks healthier than they ever did prior to the international break. Like I said, that offense was really cooking. It's not like Angel City played great in their final game of the season, but it really felt like Portland finally had those pieces of Sophia Smith, Morgan Weaver, Hina Sagita, Christine Sinclair really playing well, and I do think that their attack is what could lead them to an upset. And then North Carolina is both well-coached and talented. I think Kansas City should feel pretty good about their momentum out of the international break. They thumped Chicago on the road. They're so good at home. North Carolina is less good at home, but I think that could also be a really interesting game. But then a couple kind of final shout outs. I mean, I did sort of the wrap up for the teams that we lost, the teams that we are going off into the off season in the NWSL. And so I need to add one more team to that, which is Racing Louisville. Some good, some bad for Racing Louisville. They got so far that they gave themselves a shot to play possibly for a postseason spot in this final weekend, but ultimately didn't get to. They didn't even get to play for it, right? Which is some good. They made some ambitious transfers in the middle of the season. I like what Bev Yanez is doing as head coach, at least in terms of player management and roster management. I am curious tactically what steps forwards they could still place, but it was ambitious and yet not. They had no real foothold competitively, despite kind of nominally getting to play for playoffs at the end of the year. Racing Louisville still has never made the playoffs since joining the league in 2021. And I do think there are some legitimate questions of where do they stand. I mean, you would argue it was both harder than ever and easier than ever to make the playoffs this year, and Louisville was not able to get it done. So I'm curious to see if they think bold change is the way to go, or if they keep investing in Yanez being able to form an identity out of that group. And then one actually real quick final thing. I want to shout out the U17 U.S. Women's National Team, who got third at the World Cup over the weekend. So that's 2 youth national team bronze World Cup medals. I think we talked about the U20s getting bronze earlier this summer. The U17s get bronze this weekend, plus the senior team's Olympic gold. That's a really good year for the program. And we talked about why. We talked about this with the U20s and with the U17s. It's the further professionalization of the sport in the United States, which I know is something that people are concerned about, I think in a very healthy way. Over professionalization of the sport is not the answer necessarily. We've seen that not necessarily have the gains that we wanted to see on the men's side in the United States. But the fact that we are getting these young players into professional environments where they're supported to elevate their game, where they're playing against professional competition week in and week out, it is paying dividends in the international stage, again, with these 2 bronzes at the World Cup. Emma Hayes has talked about this futures camp that she's having in January, where there are going to be youth players playing alongside senior players. You're going to see the youth camp happen concurrently to the senior team camp. Just really feels like it was a very, very good year. We'll see how these final friendlies go for the United States, but going into this evaluation period, it just feels very good, I think, that you saw the senior team do so well and kind of empty the tank on one level. And then you see these other players who are trying to get into that player pool also doing well. Just feels like another really nice bounce back year for the United States. So this has been today's edition of The Late Sub. I am your host, Claire Watkins. Shout out for producer Adam for stepping in and producing today's episode. We will be back later in the week with a more extensive NWSL preview and another really nice interview that I'm excited to show you guys. Hope everyone's doing well out there. Kind of a stressful week in the United States, but nice to talk about some women's sports with y'all to get through it. So we'll see y'all later.